I'm John Echohawk. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. I'm a lawyer and Executive Director of the Native American Rights Fund, headquartered in Boulder, Colorado.
I'm Daniel Cordalis, staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, citizen of the Navajo Nation, and lead of NARF's Tribal Water Institute. The Tribal Water Institute is a new initiative that NARF started in 2024 to bring greater attention and more legal and political resources to addressing tribal water issues. This is an interview for the Headwaters Report. It's an online newsletter and repository for tribal water information that the Tribal Water Institute created. John, can you give us a quick explanation or description and how you would phrase what is NARF? What do we do?
The Native American Rights Fund is the National Indian Legal Defense Fund. We were established in 1970. That was at the height of the civil rights movement across the country, and black people were making a lot of progress in terms of asserting their rights to equal protection and to be free of discrimination. Even though they were very poor, they had lawyers provided by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That was a nonprofit, raised money, hired lawyers, and made them available to the black people to bring their cases, and they were very successful. So several of us across Indian country saw that and thought that we ought to do something like that for our people, because we knew we had substantial rights under federal Indian law, but we didn't have any lawyers. We were the poorest of the poor. And so we thought we need to start a legal defense fund, raise money, make lawyers available to our people to start bringing cases to enforce their rights under federal Indian law. And so that's what we started doing, and been at it 55 years now, and we've had some success.
The Tribal Water Institute, which I lead, is an outgrowth of that idea in a smaller, focused way towards tribal water issues, of course. And fast forward here now to 2025, and the length and the complexity of issues is just as great as it was, and the need is, I would say, in some ways more, because there's a bunch more demand, and we're dealing with other external factors more than we were 50 years ago. And therefore the Tribal Water Institute was born here, and I think it's just a great a reflection of kind of NARF's commitment to serving Indian country and providing resources where they're needed. So I know I'm very honored and excited to be here with you talking about this work. I know it's a passion of yours, and just a great chance to discuss this. So thank you.
Really glad to have you on board, Daniel.
Yeah. So while the Tribal Water Institute is new, of course, NARF's working on water issues is not. And it's been one of the pillars of the organization's work since day one. So can you get us started today and discuss how NARF actually first got involved in doing tribal water work?
Well, it was the result of deliberations by our first advisory council that then turned into our board of directors, and of course we all knew that there was no way we could work on everything. We had to prioritize the most important issues and work on those. You know, the way our Native people do things, we sat around in a circle and we talked about all these issues, and we knew we had to talk about them as long as it took until we had consensus about what those issues were. And we came up with a set of 5 priorities, and one of those priorities was protection of our natural resources, and an important part of that was protection of our water rights, because without water on our homelands, you know, they're not going to be able to survive. And so protecting our water rights was one of those priorities that they set. So it was something that we were familiar with as lawyers, knowing about water rights and federal Indian law, and the fact that as a result of a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1908, tribes have reserved water rights under federal law that give them precedent over most of the state water rights water holders. So in times of shortage, the tribes get their water first. And just a very important legal principle. So that's what we started working on, helping tribes to assert those tribal reserve water rights, because there was a lot of competition for water out west, and everybody knew unless we establish our water rights early, then people are going to be taking our water, and so away we went.
That's great. So aside from an organization, what drew you specifically to being interested in water work? Because while you do a lot of things as executive director, you've also taken a very particular interest in furthering our water work. So what about that? What about this field is Indian water rights is special to you?
Well, it was a course that I took in law school, water law, and it was of great interest to me because I knew it had some implications for tribes. And when I started then at the Native American Rights Fund, like I said, this became one of our priorities. And so as a new lawyer, I got assigned to do some cases, and one of those cases I worked on with more senior attorneys was a water rights case. And I remember my first one for the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe in Nevada. And we were representing them in their case, so I got to work with our staff on that, and then it just took off from there. And just really very interesting. Yeah, and that interest has continued this whole time. Yep, I've always been involved in the water work that we've had here. Yeah.
Speaking of those early attorneys that we had here, of course, David Getches, and Charles Wilkinson, and others, of course, and a lot of them continued to do a lot of water, natural resource law. Do you have any special memories or anything particular that you learned working on cases with them?
Well, just learned how to do these cases right, and deal with our tribal clients in a way that they appreciated and supported. I remember again going back to the Pyramid Lake case, the first one I worked on. Our lead attorney on that case was Bob Pelsiger, and I remember working with him on that case. And going back to Washington D.C., we had a congressional hearing on a proposed settlement of that case, and that was my really first experience in going to Washington and dealing with the powers that be up there on our important issues. And I remember that one in particular. Yeah.
What did you remember how you felt there? What it was like going up on the hill and seeing it all possibly for the first time?
Well, I was really impressed with the attention that our issues were finally getting. We were realizing that many of the people in Washington, D.C., the congressmen, senators, administration people, they didn't really know a whole lot about tribes or tribal water rights. And so it was really kind of an educational process, and it was really good to see them pay attention and learn and listen. And just a really great experience.
That's great. Of course, that's something you've done pretty much regularly since that time, is going up to the hill and trying to talk to folks. Do you feel like that kind of education component is still necessary? Have they made headway, and has there been progress, at least on the Hill, through both sides of the Congress?
Well, generally speaking, most people in this country really didn't know much about us, our rights as sovereign nations under our treaties and everything. And again, for many years, the federal policy was one of just ignoring us and terminating us, assimilating us, and of course all that changed with the self-determination era beginning in the 70s, and people gradually started learning about us, but still most people didn't know much about us. So it's, again, a gradual process of educating people about us, and over the years it's gradually gotten better, but still a lot of people don't know about these things. So one of the things we've done regularly in this tribal water rights work is have regular meetings in Washington, D.C., educating people in Congress and people in administration about our issues, and it's gotten better over the years, but still there's always new people coming in.
Right.
Some of them know about us, some of them don't, so
Yeah.
always have to make the rounds.
Yeah, it never stops, that type of work. Let's see. Kind of thinking about how tribes engage in the work, how tribal nations think about water rights, think about their water issues. I guess I'm just interested in your perspective on like what do tribal nations need to know about asserting their water rights, or how can tribes be best prepared to actually engage in their water work?
Well, it's something that I think comes up naturally for them, because they realize the importance of water and their need for water, and if they don't really have that access, then they start trying to figure out how to get that access, how to get that support, and they end up of course dealing with the legal and political situation, and that gets into federal Indian law and the Federal Reserve water rights, and so they kind of learn that way, and it's something that I think they've all gradually come to realize, and they work together in different regions and things on these issues, because even though they're all kind of different, they do have that common concern about their need for water, and so it's just something that comes up really kind of naturally.
Yeah.
But there's so many aspects to it, and they're all different, so they have to do what needs to be done to take care of their tribe.
Right. Yeah, so there's 575 different answers to the question. Yeah. You touched a little bit on kind of just how the collaboration works and just kind of the history of of the field. How is this work? Well, how has the law that addresses tribal water rights changed or not in the last, let's say, 100 years? And how has the work to assert them, from your perspective, changed in the last 50?
Well, of course, we really get our support from a U.S. Supreme Court decision made in 1908, first time the Supreme Court ever addressed the issue about tribal water rights, and there were some non-Indians upstream from a tribe in Montana that started using the water, and so the tribe downstream didn't really have the water it always had, and so that ended up in court, and who has first right to water? And the Supreme Court said, well, when the reservation got set up by Congress, they, of course, by implication, reserved enough water for that reservation and that tribe to exist. Mm-hmm. So they had the senior rights before the non-Indians came along, and so that became known as the Winter's Doctrine, reserve water rights for tribes. And the only problem was that since from 1908 on, they're just really kind of neglect by the U.S. government in terms of helping tribes and doing what they can to assert these water rights, and nothing really happened on that front until 1963, the second case the U.S. Supreme Court took up on tribal water rights, and this was a big case involving the states of Arizona and California arguing over rights to the Colorado River. Just so happened there's 5 tribes along the Colorado River, so their issues got involved in that big fight too. And the Supreme Court looked at the 1908 Winter's Doctrine case, and well, these tribes have reserve rights to water too, and so they recognized their rights along with whatever rights they eventually decided for California and Arizona. And that was just really a great development, but again, there just really wasn't much assertion of these water rights by the federal government, because the federal policy was still assimilating tribes, terminating tribes, not caring about tribes. You guys just go away, don't bother us. And that of course started changing with the civil rights movement, and of course the advent of the Native American Rights Fund, legal representation, and away we went from there, and it just really kind of changed everything. And as we talked about. Most people didn't really know much about us or our tribal water rights, and they gradually came to know.
There's something in there. It was just it struck me. You know, we were talking about Arizona and California arguing about water rights. Let's say in that case, 60 years ago. It's just over 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. Of course, they're doing that today, right? And how we're trying to fight about the allocation, the new guidelines on the Colorado River, and I think that's one really interesting thing about water law as well, and why it's so compelling is that the parties don't really change that much. The people who live along the rivers or near the rivers that need it are often the same, right? You can see some of the cases we have along the West Coast, up to Columbia, up on the Klamath, and all these other places. The parties, the people who were there, but it's still kind of the same folks. So history matters a lot to water cases. And these cases are just a lot different than a lot of the other work we do at NARF, because to sustain multiple decades of work on an adjudication is just kind of inherently different than being responsive to kind of the immediate needs sometimes tribes have. So I just think it's interesting in the way I've kind of contextualized tribal water is often that way. It's just these long fights, and one reason why I think you guys have, and we NARF, and mostly from what I can tell is your leadership, have come to the realization that there needs to be more collaboration on trying to solve these issues rather than just simple fighting, because the fighting is not going to resolve the issue. It might put out that fire, but the big fire continues to burn. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, and you can speak to this just a little bit, leading to the ad hoc group on tribal water rights settlements and our collaboration with Western States Water Council. Mm-hmm. So why does that feel so important, and why does that feel maybe so important even today?
Well, it was again the result of most people in this country really not knowing anything about us, and the change in federal policy from termination and assimilation to one of recognition of tribal self-determination and treaty rights, and the right of tribes to exist as sovereign governments, and all of that, of course, is supported by the trust and responsibility of the federal government. They made treaties with us, and they have obligations to help us enforce those treaties. That's that trust responsibility, and so as the government started helping us, that helped us with the cases. We had lawyers working for the tribes, and then the federal government as trustee, they were there with us. So, we really took off and started filing these cases, and these states out west started seeing these cases being filed, and these claims by tribes for senior water rights over a lot of the state water rights users based on this Winters Doctrine. And they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know anything about this, and so they started complaining and wanting to do something about that, and they were after the tribes about that, and so then the tribes, of course, looked to us at the Native American Rights Fund to help them respond, and so we ended up having a big meeting in Denver in the early '80s, called by the Western Governors Association. What's all of this tribal water rights stuff about? They said, you guys are claiming senior rights over state water users, and and so the tribes had us respond to them, and basically explain to them this Winters Doctrine going back to 1908, and the change in federal policy and the trust responsibility, and the governors and their attorney generals, they didn't really know much about this at all, and so they were learning it. Here's the law, and okay. So, wow, okay, well, these cases you guys are filing, they require joinder of everyone claiming water rights on a river. And these are the largest cases in the West that are getting filed. And it's going to take decades to do this litigation. So in the meantime, everybody doesn't really know what water rights they have or not. It's all this uncertainty that, of course, impacts business impacts the economies. And so, wow, this is something that's really scary. And is there anything we can do about that? And we said, yes, there is. You can recognize these rights and we can settle these cases now. And they said, okay, well, let's do that. Let's talk. Let's get these things settled, and let's get this show on the road. So, of course, we needed the involvement of the federal government. So the first thing we did is planned a big meeting back in Washington, D.C. to go back and meet with the administration. And so we did that, and the federal government thought, yeah, that's a good idea. You guys have a point. We need to get these things settled instead of litigating forever. So let's put together this settlement process. So they put together a Indian Water Rights Settlement Team in the Office of the Secretary of the Interior, and started leading the way in terms of putting together settlement teams and negotiating the settlements with the states and the tribes, and away we went. That was in the early 80s, and now we've got, 38 settlements. Yeah, I think the Native American Rights Fund been involved in representing tribes on 9 of those, and of course then we've got another 20-something pending. I think we're involved in 4 or 5 of those, and it's just a process that goes on.
Yeah. You just talked about the kind of the start of the settlement process and how we were able to partner with our western states to basically explain and develop something that's workable. Of course, that was like 45 years ago, and we've had a good relationship with all those entities since. Curious your reflection on how it's worked. How do you think it's been working? We currently run into, and this is probably no different, but it's always been funding challenges. But things have changed over the last several decades. So I'm just kind of interested in your perspective on maybe how you've seen it change. If you see anything that needs maybe some tweaking, or if you feel like we're still in a pretty good place to, and if just some thoughts about the whole settlement process and that kind of collaborative work there.
Well, getting involved with the western states on that, we really got assigned by the Western Governors Association to work with the Western States Water Council, which is a council made up of all of the state water directors. And we really developed good relationships with them because they knew this was an important issue, and we're always ready to listen and learn about tribes and tribal water rights. And as the settlement negotiations started, you could really kind of see them open their eyes in terms of realizing who we were, and the needs we had, how they needed to be resolved if the states were going to be able to determine their state water rights. And you could just see kind of a learning process, and they really kind of got to be friends with the tribes as they learned about them and go out to the reservations. And a lot of them had never met Indians before, or been to reservations, or didn't know anything about us, and you could just see them learning, and they just really appreciated that, and seeing that we had real needs just like they did, and we could work together to resolve those things. And it was just a real gratifying thing to watch develop as these settlement negotiations proceeded, and then to have the settlements start getting introduced in Congress. The states and the tribes coming together, with the support of the federal administration, wanting to get these things done. And then we run into the problem we've always seen as the biggest problem in terms of getting these settlements done, and that is getting the funding to implement the settlements. And of course, in Washington, D.C., as everybody knows, it's always difficult to master that budget process. The allocation of funds by Congress and appropriations and things. There's so much competition for the limited amount of federal dollars that are there. And that's always been the biggest issue. But as people come to learn how important these issues are to get resolved, then we kind of move up the priority scale. Oh, it's really important to get these things resolved because it's impacting the economy, the certainty of water rights and everything. So we gradually get some attention, but of course the budget situation changes from Congress to Congress, administration to administration, and so the budget issue's always been the big one.
Yeah.
Always been the big one. We've generally been able to come up with a way to resolve the water rights issues, live together and everything, but then to get the funds to implement that settlement, because it oftentimes involved different kinds of infrastructure, for everybody to get the access to their water, and so that costs money, and so that's been the difficult part, and it's still difficult.
Yeah, and it's if you step back and look at it, it's really just frustrating that basically these legal rights too. I mean, they're legal rights, but they're also just a lot of times human rights, because we're talking about access to clean drinking water for so many tribes.
Yes.
I mean, those are kind of just basic staples of healthy communities, and they're settlements are terrific vehicles to get things done, but they can also subject those kind of basic rights to political whim, right? And we just won't pass things because somebody doesn't like something else on the Hill, and so it's just another one of these oddities and frustrations with the process that we kind of have to live through. What would you tell a tribal leader who's considering a settlement, and he's coming to you, John, we got these water rights. How do I think about engaging in a settlement process? What should I be telling my tribal council about this?
Well, we just have to get ready to reach out to the state and the state water users and educate them about the tribe's needs, and then federal Indian law and the Winter's Doctrine, Indian Reserve water rights, because again, so many people don't know about that, and then this history that we've been talking about here the last 45 years with the settlement process underway, and just kind of get them educated about that, and that's the way to do it, and get started.
Yeah, that's the thing, get started, because we have, like you said, probably 38, 39 settlements and hundreds of tribes. That kind of brings me to my next question, is where do you think this field of Indian water is headed? I mean, geographically, we have tribes in the Great Plains, the Great Lakes, who haven't really engaged in adjudication processes. I mean, we always kind of thought there was plenty of water, and it was kind of a Western issue, but now we know it's not. And we have tribes all over the country who are interested in their water rights, but they're, interestingly, perhaps even a little bit behind the Western tribes, who have at least been seeing this stuff for years, at least decades. So, at least from a place-based perspective, I mean, how does it look that way? Then I have another question about climate change after that. But when I think about like where are the issues headed? Where's the next big fights for the tribes on water?
Well, they could be anywhere, but again, because it's in an area that's got more water than out west, where most of these issues have happened. They've got to deal with the different laws in those places, and that's what they call riparian law, and it's not prior appropriation like the West, first come, first serve. Whoever's there first gets the water. Riparian systems, everybody has to share, so it's a sharing system. Okay, how do the tribes fit into that system, and so how does the Winter's Doctrine adapt to that situation? So it's a challenge, and but it can be done, and again, more and more people are getting to know about tribes and our needs and our rights and things. So with all the experience we've had on this, there's I think good opportunities to get those things done and get started.
Yeah. And because some of those tribes have more access to water, I feel like some of their rights are more aquatic base, some of their like non-water rights. Like, and this kind of goes back to our early case in US v. Washington, right? When we talked about fishing rights, and we got salmon rights up and down the coast. We got other harvesting rights in the Great Lakes and fishing rights there. How do you see that, and the focus on who has jurisdiction and the overlay of climate change really impacting availability of water and water quality? To me, they're not necessarily new fields for tribes to be involved in, but there hasn't been, I mean, it also feels like a little bit of a different approach than we've done here at NARF before.
Yeah, it's really kind of impacted by these environmental issues that you mentioned, climate change, and then the Clean Water Act.
Yeah.
You know, those are issues that the tribes have to be involved in. They have rights to clean water. You know, they are impacted by the environmental laws as well, and you know, by climate change and all the issues that come up on that. And we just have to be ready to work with the states on all of those issues. And of course, that's something that's taken place, like that. One case we've got going here, where with the states in finalizing their Clean Water Act regulations, they have to take into account tribal water rights.
Yep.
They can't ignore us.
Right. Yeah. One way that we think about this in my house, which includes Amy, former NARF staff attorney as well, is that a lot of these early fights that NARF did was really the protection of the right. You know, they're just these fundamental, like bedrock, like the treaty rights exist. You know, they're big impact litigation. And now, for some of this work, especially water-based work, we see ourselves fighting for not necessarily the right, but what that right also protects, right? For our communities who maybe have a water right, that make sure they have those clean water so they can do ceremonies, so they can get in the river when they need to, they can take fish when they need to, because you know, salmon runs from all over, or fish runs all over the United States are hurting, and it's kind of a really interesting and kind of in a way kind of a sad change, because we've had such good work done on theirs, and then we had to create an Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act, because we just didn't care enough to take care of some of these resources. And yeah, no, I appreciate that you think about those species and the collaborative work necessary to take care of those rights. Yeah. How would you say that NARF and other organizations have changed the landscape of tribal water rights?
Basically provided legal representation for tribes on these things, and educated the states and the federal government and the American public about these rights. And it's all come about here in the last 55 years, again, as part of the change in federal Indian policy, where they were trying to assimilate us and terminate us, and now recognizing that we're one of three sovereign governments in this country. There's a federal government, a state government, tribal governments, and we've got treaties, we've got rights under these treaties that have to be respected, and it's just really kind of changed everything over the years, and all that continues.
Are there any water issues coming up that you think we could be, NARF specifically, but Indian country generally, kind of more focused on, or maybe more forceful on?
Oh, wow, it's a good thing we've got the Tribal Water Institute, because it can help us sort through all those things. We've got so many requests for assistance on these water-related issues that now we can sort through them all and figure out the ones that are most important things we can do something about. And it's really difficult, but I think the biggest problems are driven by climate change, and the water shortages, and this really is a test of the whole system. How does the whole system deal with this climate change and water shortages and things?
Yeah.
To me, that's the biggest one.
Yeah, and we have our tribal nations in New Mexico and the Pueblos just maybe the worst off.
Yeah,
The Colorado River really being at a reckoning moment as well. And most western rivers having some significant sorts of quantity and quality issues.
Yeah, just kind of looking at the snowpack reports, and snowpack's really low in just about every one of the basins, so we're going to have some more serious shortage issues here this coming summer, and it's going to be difficult to kind of learn how to deal with those things.
Yeah. I think we've both seen, a kind of a, wouldn't call it a resurgence, but a really good focus and a kind of some shared principles by tribes in the Colorado River Basin in the last few years, really focused on trying to be more assertive on their kind of their needs there. In the absence of so many things, especially with Navajo Nation cases. And that kind of put a really fine point in COVID on the lack of the water to support and protect communities in times of shortage. So, what has been your favorite thing about working at NARF?
Well, being able to address the big legal issues that tribes have that they bring to us, and being able to be responsive, to be able to help. And of course, as a nonprofit, that means having a staff who's able to do that, and to have that staff, it's all about raising money, fundraising, and so
every day.
That's something I really concentrate on and focus on. We've got a great fundraising staff and things, and it's just really good to see here over the years we've gradually grown. And we're at the point now where we've got 26 lawyers and 3 offices, and we've never ever been that large. So it's really great to see that kind of response from the philanthropic community to come in and help us provide these resources to tribes through our legal representation.
Yeah, that's great. Then maybe you just answered this, I don't know. But the last question I have is, what are you most proud of achieving during your time here at NARF?
Well, really the development of our self-determination and sovereignty, that change in federal policy, the year we started in 1970, and to see tribes gradually grow, all the tribes benefit and become more economically self-sufficient and able to manage their own affairs, and just see that they're major players in this country. And we're an important part of what makes this country tick. And of course, that wasn't the way it was when we first started. We were just left behind. And now we've come along, and now we're a very important part of America. And just to see that over the years is just super. And hopefully that can continue.
Yeah. No, that's an incredible point, and what a privilege to sit there in the director's chair watching that and being a part of that. Well, thank you for talking with us about your experience here and our tribal water issues. So,
looking forward to doing more work on those.
Yeah, we have it coming. So
let's do it.
Yeah, thanks.